Snow came sideways across the nation's creek basin at 11 degrees, and Mara Voss knelt in it with her bare right hand plunged into an 18-inch stone box, feeling for the thread of water that meant the spring was still open. It was there, thin as catgut, cold enough to burn, but moving. She pulled her hand back, jammed it under her armpit, and counted the cattle pressed against the drift fence by lantern light. Backs white, breath rising off 200 heads like steam off a kettle. Somewhere behind her a dog barked twice, short, and stopped. She didn't turn. The fence was groaning under the weight of animals leaning into it for shelter, and 40 yards downslope a rider she didn't recognize was face down in a snowbank that hadn't been there an hour before. "Hold," she said to no one, to the fence itself, and went to dig him out. The wind took the rest of what she might have said. 3 months earlier, the land had nothing on it but rock, silverleaf sage, and a reputation. "You want the Callaway section," Del Whitlock told her, standing in the bank doorway and Prosper with his thumbs in his belt like he owned the weather too. "You're buying 2,000 acres of alkali flat and a dry gulch with delusions of being a creek. Man could run 400 head on the Bell place next door. You'll be lucky to keep 40 alive past January." Mara signed the paper anyway. She had $81, a wagon, a 14-year-old hired boy named Eli Marsh whose family couldn't feed him, a gray gelding called Ash, a yellow dog of no particular breed named Compass, and a cedar box that had belonged to her husband Thomas, dead 11 months of a fever that took him in 6 days. Inside the box was a notebook, the leather gone soft and dark at the corners from handling, and on the first page, in Thomas's flat carpenter's hand, "Land that won't hold water for a man won't hold water for a cow either. Fix the water, the land forgives everything else." She hadn't understood it then. She understood it a good deal better by the second week. The Callaway section had been abandoned twice, once by the Callaways, once by a Kansas syndicate that grazed it bare and left. What it had, that nobody in Prosper seemed to credit, was a limestone outcrop running the length of the north boundary, honeycombed with seams, and at the base of that outcrop, under 11 feet of gravel and silt, a spring that had been flowing before the Callaways ever filed a claim. Thomas's father had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania before he came west, and he'd taught his son the old trick of building a spring box, not a well, not a dug pond, but a stone crib sunk directly over the source, capped and channeled, so the water came up clean and cold instead of spreading thin into mud and freezing solid by December. The notebook gave her 3 numbers to start with. A box no smaller than 3 feet by 3 feet, walled with dry-laid stone at least 14 inches thick, set on a bed of 6 inches of washed gravel so the spring could breathe without silting shut. A capstone with a 6-inch overflow notch cut on the downhill side, angled at roughly 10 degrees, so ice couldn't dam the outflow and burst the box in a hard freeze. And distance. The box wanted to sit no more than 60 feet from where the water first showed itself in the ground, or the flow would scatter and weaken before it ever reached the stone. She dug in the wrong place first. She found dampness 30 yards east of the outcrop, in a low swale that looked, to her eye, like the obvious low point where water would gather. She and Eli spent 9 days hauling stone down off the ridge with the wagon and Ash straining in the traces, and they built a box 4 feet square, walled to spec, capped to spec. It filled with 6 inches of standing water and stopped. "Told you," Del Whitlock said, riding the property line the way he did every 10 days or so, ostensibly checking his own fence, in truth checking hers. "That's not a spring, Mrs. Voss. That's a puddle with ambitions. You'll want real cattle water trucked in by March, and I know a man who'll charge you 11 cents a barrel to do it." Eli didn't say anything. He never did much. But that night he sat by the fire with the notebook open across his knees and read the springbox passage 3 more times. And in the morning he walked the outcrop on his hands and knees, the way you track a wounded animal, until he found a patch of grass 6 shades greener than the grass around it, 40 feet north of where they'd dug, right where the limestone shelf cut down into the ground at an angle. "Water don't come up where it's easy," he said, the longest sentence Mara had heard out of him in a week. "Comes up where the rock lets it." They moved the box. This time she cut the overflow notch exactly as the notebook specified, 10 degrees, 6 inches wide, and she tied a length of undyed wool thread across the notch mouth before she ever set the capstone. Thomas's trick, the same one his father had used, so that a slow trickle would keep the thread swaying, and a stopped flow would leave it hanging dead still. For 2 days the thread didn't move at all, and she sat on an overturned bucket in the cold each evening and watched it like she was waiting on a verdict. On the third morning it swayed. Not much. A half inch, then back, then a half inch again, steady as a heartbeat. She didn't cry over it. She wrote it down instead. In the ledger she kept nailed open to a board by the cabin door, a running column of numbers Thomas had taught her to keep, because a man who doesn't write down what a thing costs him will lie to himself about it later. Spring box, second attempt, 14 days labor. Flow confirmed, third morning, October 9th. Cost to date, $19.40 in supplies, immeasurable in boot leather. Eli grinned at that last line. It was the first time she'd seen him do it since his mother died the year before. Winter work and Prosper ran on gossip the way a mill runs on water, and the gossip that fall ran 3 ways. Ruth Calder, who kept the post office, told anyone who'd listen that the Voss widow was digging holes in the ground like a badger and ought to be pitied more than blamed. Wendell Price, who ran the mercantile, extended her a small line of credit against the theory that a woman who paid her debts on time, even in nickels, was worth the risk regardless of what her land could or couldn't grow. Otis Bell, whose family owned the good grass next door, said the kindest thing anyone in town managed, which was that he'd seen worse gambles pay off, though he allowed he'd also seen a great many more fail entire. The scaling up came in November, and it cost more than the digging had. Thomas's notebook described a second structure meant to work alongside the spring box, what he called a drift fence, not for holding cattle in, but for making snow lie down where you wanted it instead of where the wind wanted it. Built right, angled roughly 30 degrees off the prevailing northwest wind, staggered in 2 offset rows 16 feet apart, it would force drifting snow to pile itself into a long, low wall on the lee side, and that wall, paradoxically, became the warmest, most sheltered ground on the whole section. Cattle could bed down against it out of the wind while the fence did the work of a windbreak that would have taken 20 years to grow from planted trees. She and Eli built 400 yards of it through the first 3 weeks of November, splitting cedar posts by hand, and on the 18th August took 11 posts down in a single afternoon because she'd set them at 20 degrees instead of 30, misjudging the prevailing wind off a week of unusually calm weather. 11 posts, $40 of split cedar, 3 days of labor, gone in an hour. That night she sat with the ledger and didn't write anything for a long time. Eli found her there. Man could think this is more than the land's worth, he said, which was, for him, practically a narration. Man could, she agreed. Man be wrong, but he could think it. She reset the fence at 31 degrees the next morning, 1 degree of margin beyond the number in the notebook, and it held. By the first week of December, the spring box was running a steady 4 gallons a minute, even in hard frost, piped through a buried wooden trough Thomas's notebook, called a frost line, laid 2 feet under grade, so the ground itself kept the water from freezing solid between the box and the drinking trough at the corral. The drift fence stood finished, for 100 yards of staggered cedar catching the first true snows of the season and laying them down gentle, instead of letting them scour bare or pile into the corral itself. 40 head of her own scrub cattle, bought cheap off ranchers thinning their herds rather than winter them, stood fat and watered through weather that had other outfits hauling barrels on sledges. Del Whitlock rode the line on December the 14th and said nothing at all, which from him was nearly an apology. The signs came 4 days later, and nobody but Mara and Eli read them right. The barometer glass Thomas had carried west from Pennsylvania, hanging inside the cabin door, dropped 9/10 of an inch between sunup and noon, a fall she'd seen described in his notebook as the kind that comes before something remembers it's a mountain. Compass wouldn't settle. He circled the cabin 3 times at dusk, and then sat facing north, ears up, refusing supper. Ash paced his stall and wouldn't take the bit easy the next morning, tossing his head at nothing, and around the ring of the moon that night sat a ring so wide and pale it looked like a second, dimmer moon had been painted around the first. Storm ring, Eli said. Big one. Del Whitlock, passing on his way back from Prosper with supplies lashed to his saddle, looked at the same sky and shrugged. Ring like that's nothing. Had 3 of 'em last winter, weather never came. He nodded at the drift fence. Your fence'll fall over first good wind, same as your posts did in November. He was 30 miles wrong within 18 hours. The blizzard that hit the nation's Creek Basin on the night of December the 19th came down out of Canada at 40 miles an hour with the temperature falling to 11 below by midnight. And it caught Otis Bell's herd and Del Whitlock's herd both out on open range where the good grass was. Grass with nothing between it and the wind but a scatter of cottonwoods along a creek that offered no shelter at all once the snow started moving sideways instead of down. Cattle do what cattle have always done in a storm like that. They turn their backs to the wind and drift with it, and the wind that night was blowing due south, straight off the open range and straight onto the Callaway section nobody had wanted. By the time Mara heard the first bawling carried on the wind, past 10 o'clock, she was already out at the spring box making sure the frost line hadn't choked, lantern hooked to a fence post, and compass at her heel giving out that same short bark he'd given the day the moon ring showed. She saw the first cattle come over the rise a few minutes later, backs white, moving in that stumbling, wind-driven walk of animals with no more will of their own left in them. And within the hour there were 200 head or more piled up against her drift fence, packed shoulder to shoulder in the lee of it exactly the way Thomas's notebook said they would. The fence held. It bowed under the weight of that many animals leaning into the lee side of it, and twice she heard a post crack somewhere down the line, a sound like a rifle shot swallowed by wind. But the staggered rows did their work. Snow piled up behind the first row and packed hard against the second, and the wall of drift that built itself over those 2 hours was taller than a man on horseback, and warmer, by her own hand held bare against it, than the open air by a good 20 degrees. The trough at the corral froze anyway, ice skinning over 4 inches thick despite the frost line, and that was the moment nearest to failure. 200 head and 40 of her own, with no water, and a fence groaning under strain, and no way to chop that much ice fast enough with the wind cutting visibility to nothing. She went back to the spring box itself, worked the capstone loose with a bar in freezing dark, and ran a second channel straight off the box into the corral by hand, digging a shallow trench in already frozen ground with a fence spade while Eli held the lantern and the dog stood over her shivering and would not leave. It took 40 minutes. Her hands stopped feeling like hands somewhere in the middle of it. When the water broke through and ran fresh into the corral, black against the snow, cattle that hadn't moved in an hour turned toward it on instinct before she'd even gotten back to her feet. That was when she found the rider. He'd come looking for his drifted herd on horseback against every rule a sane man follows in a storm like that, and his horse had gone down in a drift 40 yards off her fence line, and he'd crawled the rest of the way and then simply stopped, the way a man does when the cold finally does his thinking for him. She knew the shape of him before she reached him. Del Whitlock, face down, one arm flung out toward the fence he'd told her would fall over. She and Eli dragged him the last 20 feet by his coat collar, one on each arm, boots skidding on packed snow, and got him inside the ring of the drift wall where the wind dropped by half, and the cattle's own body heat had already begun to soften the air. He came around groaning within a few minutes, cursing the cold in a voice too weak to carry much conviction, and the first thing his eyes found, once they'd focus on anything, was the fence, his own weight, and 200 head of drifted cattle, all leaning safe into cedar posts he'd called worthless not 6 weeks before. He didn't say anything about that. Not that night, and not for 3 days after. While his herd and Otis Bell's herd both wintered against Mara Voss's drift fence and drank from Mara Voss's spring, the alkali flat, and the dry gulch with delusions of being a creek keeping more cattle alive that week than the good grass next door ever had. The storm broke on the 22nd. Del Whitlock rode out to gather what remained of his own herd, thinner by 11 head lost before ever reaching her fence, and as he passed the corral he stopped, dismounted without a word, and reset a fence post that had cracked and gone crooked under the weight of the storm. Reset it at 31 degrees, the exact angle she'd corrected to back in November. Though nobody had told him the number, and he had no reason to know it except that his eye, finally, had learned to read the land the Wayhurst had. Ruth Calder told it around Prosper for years afterward that the widow Voss had saved 2 ranches worth of cattle with a rock box and a fence made of scrap cedar, though she never got the numbers quite right in the telling. Wendell Price extended her credit without asking that spring, and Otis Bell sent 2 hands over in April to help her run a second drift fence along the east boundary, unasked, and never once mentioned payment. Mara updated the ledger on the morning of the 23rd, in the flat carpenter's hand she'd caught, without meaning to, from a dead man's notebook. Cattle sheltered, 214 head, not counting our own 40. Losses, none, this section. Fence posts replaced, 9. Spring flow, hard freeze, unbroken. She looked at the number for a long moment, and then added one more line beneath it, smaller, the only line in the whole ledger that wasn't a measurement of cost or yield. Land forgave. By the second week of January, the basin had gone quiet again. Cattle scattered back to their own range. Del Whitlock's fence line repaired, and his manner, if not warmer, at least considerably less certain of itself. Eli had taken to reading the notebook most evenings without being asked, copying its numbers into a second book of his own in a hand that was starting, very slightly, to slant the same way Thomas's had. On a clear morning near the end of the month, with the thread across the spring box notch swaying steady as ever and the drift fence standing white-capped and quiet along the north line, Mara knelt again at the stone crib, same as she had the night of the storm, and worked her bare hand down into the cold water to check the flow the way she did most mornings now, out of habit more than worry. It moved against her fingers, thin and constant. The land never forgave anything, she thought, working the feeling back into her hand before she stood. It only ever answered what was built on it correctly. She capped the box, called the dog, and went to see about breakfast.